The ground is shaking, not from an earthquake, from footsteps, 100,000 of them, maybe 300,000, marching toward a narrow mountain pass where you are standing with 300 men. No reinforcements coming. No escape planned. The largest army in human history is walking toward you, and you are not moving.
History is not just written, it is forged.
Before you can understand what happened at Thermopylae, you need to understand what kind of man was standing in that pass. Because the Spartans you have seen in movies, slow-motion warriors in red capes, oiled muscles, dramatic speeches, that is Hollywood. The reality was something far darker, far more extreme, and far more fascinating. Sparta was a city-state in southern Greece. Small, rocky, not wealthy, not beautiful, but it produced something no other city in the ancient world could match. The perfect warrior. And the system that created him began not on a battlefield, but in a nursery. When a baby was born in Sparta, it was not immediately celebrated. It was examined. City elders inspected every newborn for signs of weakness, sickness, or deformity. If the child appeared strong, it was returned to its family. If it did not, it was taken to the hills outside the city and left there. This was not cruelty for its own sake. To Spartans, this was logic, survival. A weak soldier does not just die, he gets the man beside him killed too. Weakness was a threat to everyone. So weakness was eliminated from the very beginning. For those who survived that first inspection, the real test had not even started. At age 7 years old, Spartan boys were separated from their mothers, taken from their homes, placed into a brutal state program called the Agoge. The Agoge was not a school. It was not a training camp in any modern sense. It was a systematic destruction of comfort, followed by a rebuilding of the human being from the ground up. Boys were deliberately underfed, not by accident, by design. Hunger was a lesson. A warrior who cannot function while starving is useless on a long campaign. So they learned to function hungry. They were given one thin garment to wear through all seasons, including the freezing Greek winters. Cold was a lesson. Discomfort was a lesson. Every form of suffering they might face in war was introduced to them first as a child, so that by the time they faced it in battle, it felt familiar. They slept on reeds. They cut themselves from the riverbank with bare hands. They were beaten regularly, not as punishment, but as conditioning, to teach the body to absorb pain without the mind breaking without crying out, without showing the enemy anything. They were also taught to steal food, not because Sparta encouraged theft, but because a warrior cut off from supplies must survive by any means. Resourcefulness was not optional, it was survival. But here is the part that reveals everything about the Spartan mind. If a boy was caught stealing, he was not punished for stealing. He was punished for being caught. This training lasted 13 years. 13 years of cold, hunger, pain, isolation, and relentless discipline before a Spartan male was considered ready to even begin his military service. By age 20, he joined the army. He lived in barracks with his unit, not with his wife, not with his children, until age 30. His brothers in that unit were his family. His loyalty to Sparta came before everything else. And what did 13 years of the Agoge produce? A man who had already faced his absolute limit and walked through it. A man who did not fear hunger, cold, pain, or death, because he had been introduced to all of them as a child and had survived every single time. A man who, when the ground began shaking from 100,000 Persian footsteps, did not reach for an escape. He reached for his spear. Now let us talk about what was marching toward them. Because understanding the Spartans is only half the story. The other half is understanding the scale of what they were facing, and why facing it at all was considered by almost everyone in the ancient world to be an act of madness. In 480 BC, the Persian Empire was not simply powerful. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from modern-day Iran across Egypt, through Turkey, and deep into Central Asia. Persia controlled roughly 40% of the entire world's population. Every kingdom it encountered was given a simple choice: submit or be destroyed. Most submitted, the ones that did not, were made into examples. And leading this empire was a man who did not think of himself as simply a king. Xerxes I called himself the King of Kings, the ruler above all rulers, chosen by the gods, destined to bring the entire known world under one throne. His throne. But beneath that divine confidence lived something more dangerous than ambition. A wound. 10 years before Thermopylae, Xerxes' father, King Darius, had sent a massive Persian army to conquer Greece, and the Greeks had done something that stunned the entire ancient world. They won. At the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, a Greek force, smaller, lighter, fighting on their own soil, had met the Persians on an open plain and crushed them completely. The Persian army, considered unbeatable, had broken and fled back to their ships. The humiliation echoed across the empire. Darius never recovered from it. He spent the rest of his life planning revenge against Greece, and died before he could deliver it. So Xerxes inherited two things from his father: the most powerful empire on earth, and an unfinished war. For years, Xerxes prepared with a focus that bordered on obsession. He assembled an army of a scale that had never existed before. Ancient historian Herodotus claimed the force numbered over 2.5 million soldiers. Modern historians place the real figure between 100,000 and 300,000. Even at the lowest estimate, 100,000 men. This was a force capable of swallowing entire nations without slowing down. They came by land and by sea simultaneously. Xerxes reportedly ordered a bridge of boats constructed across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, so his army could walk from one continent to the other. When storms destroyed his first bridge, he was so enraged, he ordered his soldiers to whip the sea itself 300 times as punishment for defying him. That is the kind of man who was coming. When Xerxes sent messengers to the Greek city-states demanding earth and water, the ancient symbol of total surrender, most of them complied immediately. Most gave up without raising a single sword. But not Sparta. When the Persian messengers arrived and delivered their demand, the Spartans did not negotiate. They did not delay. They threw the messengers into a well. You want earth and water, they said. Find them at the bottom. The war was now unavoidable. And somewhere in Greece, 300 men were already being chosen to face it. First, Greece knew it could not win a fair fight. 100,000 Persian soldiers against the combined armies of every Greek city-state that had not surrendered. The numbers still did not work. Open battlefield meant open slaughter. The Persians had cavalry, archers, and sheer mass. A Greek army standing in a flat field against that force would not be defeated. It would be erased. So the Greeks did not plan for a fair fight. They planned for the only kind of fight they could win. Thermopylae. The name in ancient Greek means hot gates, named for the natural hot springs that bubbled up from the earth along the coastline there. It was a narrow pass on the eastern shore of Greece, where the mountains descended so sharply toward the sea that moving an army through. It was less like marching and more like threading a needle. At its narrowest point, the pass was 14 meters wide. 14 meters, the width of a tennis court. In that 14-meter space, the Persian advantages vanished one by one. Their cavalry was useless. No room to charge, no room to maneuver. Their archers lost much of their effectiveness at close range in a confined corridor. Their numbers, the single most terrifying thing about the Persian army, meant almost nothing when only a few dozen men could engage at the front at any given moment. And the Greek weapon of choice in exactly this terrain was devastating. The phalanx. Spartan warriors stood shoulder to shoulder in tight formation. Their large round shields, called hoplon, locked together into a continuous wall of bronze. Behind that wall, spears nearly 3 meters long extended forward in overlapping rows. The front rank absorbed the impact of any charge. The ranks behind pushed forward with their shields, creating pressure the enemy could not break through, and the spear tips reaching over and between shields meant that the men hitting that wall were not just stopped. They were killed before they could even swing back. To attack a Spartan phalanx head-on in a narrow mountain pass was not a military strategy. It was a death sentence. The Greek alliance sent between 5,000 and 7,000 soldiers to hold Thermopylae. Among them, 300 Spartans, led by King Leonidas himself. But here is what almost no one tells you. Sparta could have sent far more men. The full Spartan army was available and ready. But Sparta was observing the Carneia, a sacred religious festival, during which Spartan law absolutely forbade military action. Sending any soldiers at all was already pushing the boundary of that law. The 300 sent were a special advance force, chosen personally by Leonidas, and they were selected using one single criterion. Every man chosen had already fathered a son. Not the strongest, not the youngest, not the most decorated, the ones with sons. Because Leonidas knew where he was taking these men. He knew the probability of return. And he refused to take a single Spartan whose bloodline would die with him in that pass. These men understood what the selection meant. They packed their things, said goodbye to their families, and marched north. Not one of them asked to be replaced. The Persian army arrived at Thermopylae and stopped. Xerxes looked at what was blocking the path to Greece. A few thousand men, standing in a narrow coastal pass, shields raised, spears forward. Completely still, he waited 4 days before ordering the attack. Perhaps he believed the sight of his army, stretching back further than any Greek could see, would break their resolve without a single drop of blood being spilled. Perhaps he thought they would come to their senses, lay down their weapons, walk away. The Greeks did not move. On the 5th day, Xerxes gave the order. The Medes went in first. They were not ordinary soldiers. The Medes were experienced, battle-hardened infantry, among the finest fighters in the Persian Empire. They entered the pass in formation, shields up, pushing forward with the confidence of men who had broken enemy lines across 3 continents. They hit the Spartan shield wall, and the shield wall did not move. What happened next confused the Persians completely, because it looked nothing like any battle they had ever fought. The Spartans did not simply hold their ground and absorb the assault. They pushed back, drove the Persian line backward with coordinated force, and then, without warning, they broke formation and ran, retreated. The Persians surged forward instantly. A retreating enemy is a breaking enemy. The Persian line dissolved into pursuit, soldiers rushing forward in disorder, the tight formation gone, every man running to be the first to cut down a fleeing Greek. And then the Spartans stopped running. They turned. In perfect unison, reformed the phalanx in a single motion, and walked back into the Persians, who were now spread out, disorganized, completely exposed. The slaughter was one-sided. This was not luck. This was not improvisation. This was a tactic the Spartans had practiced until it lived in their muscles. The false retreat, the instant reformation, the lethal turn. They executed it again and again throughout that first day. Draw the Persians forward, break their formation, turn, kill. Wave after wave entered the pass. Wave after wave did not come back out. Xerxes watched from a golden throne placed on a hillside above the battlefield, elevated so he could observe the entire engagement. Herodotus wrote that Xerxes rose from that throne 3 times during the first day of fighting. 3 times. Not to cheer, not to celebrate. In horror, in disbelief at what he was watching. His soldiers, the soldiers of the greatest empire on earth, dying by the hundreds against a force they outnumbered by ratios that should have made the outcome a foregone conclusion. He sat back down each time. But the image of those 3 moments, a god-king rising from his throne in shock, tells you everything about what the Spartans were doing in that pass. On the 2nd day, Xerxes sent his answer. The Immortals, 10,000 of the finest warriors the Persian Empire possessed, named the Immortals because their ranks never visibly thinned. When one fell, another stepped immediately forward to fill his place. So the number never dropped below 10,000. To face them was to face a force that appeared to be unkillable. They entered the pass. They met the phalanx. They failed. 2 days. 2 days of relentless assault by the most powerful military force on the planet. Medes, elite infantry, the Immortals themselves, and the pass had not moved an inch from Greek hands. The bodies of Persian soldiers were piling up at the mouth of Thermopylae. The hot gates were living up to their name. That night, Xerxes called his commanders together. Every frontal assault had failed. Every tactic had been neutralized by that 14-meter bottleneck. And the men defending it, the math that made his army invincible in open ground, simply did not apply here. He needed another way. And that was when a man appeared at the edge of the Persian camp. A local Greek man, carrying information. His name was Ephialtes. And what he was about to say would change everything. Ephialtes of Trachis was a Greek man who lived in the mountains near Thermopylae. He knew these peaks the way most men know the streets outside their own home. Every trail, every ridge, every hidden path that the goats used to cross from one side of the mountain to the other. And on the night of the second day, while the bodies of Persian soldiers still lay cooling at the mouth of the pass, he walked into the enemy camp and offered to sell everything he knew. What Ephialtes told Xerxes was this: there was another path, not through the pass, around it, a narrow mountain trail that wound up through the peaks above Thermopylae, looped behind the entire Greek position, and came out on the other side, directly behind Leonidas and his men. The hot gates could not be broken from the front, but from behind they were just men standing in a field. Xerxes moved immediately. That same night, he dispatched 10,000 Immortals along the hidden trail, guided through the darkness, personally, by Ephialtes, who walked at the front and led them step by step through terrain no Persian commander would have found alone in a month of searching. The Greeks had anticipated this possibility. 1,000 Phocian soldiers had been stationed on that mountain path, specifically to guard against a flanking move. They were positioned in the trees, watching the trail, waiting. But what emerged from the forest at dawn was not a scouting party. It was 10,000 Immortals materializing silently out of the morning mist in an unbroken line that stretched back further than the Phocians could see. The Phocians made a decision. They retreated to higher ground to protect themselves, and the path behind Leonidas was open. A Greek runner reached the pass before dawn. Leonidas received the news in silence. He already knew what it meant. There was no tactical complexity to work through, no alternative strategy to consider. The pass had protected them from the front, but with 10,000 Immortals, coming from behind. The pass was now simply the place where they were going to die. He gathered his commanders. He looked at each of them, and he made the only decision that was left to make. The name Ephialtes, after that night, became something else entirely in the Greek language. It became their word for nightmare. He had earned it completely. Leonidas had a choice. It was a real choice, a clear choice, an available choice that any reasonable commander in any army, in any era of history, would have taken without a second thought. He could retreat. He was a king, the most valuable military asset Sparta possessed. No one would have called him a coward. The math was undeniable. 10,000 immortals coming from behind. An endless Persian force still pressing from the front. Every military instinct, every calculation of survival, every voice of reason pointed in one direction, south. Leonidas pointed north. He ordered the Greek allies to retreat immediately. Thousands of soldiers from Corinth, Arcadia, and other city-states received the order and marched south, away from the closing trap, back toward their homes and families, and the chance to fight again another day. This was not cowardice. This was Leonidas making sure that what he was about to do would not waste the lives of men who still had battles ahead of them. He kept the 300 Spartans, and then something happened that history has never given enough weight to. 700 soldiers from the city of Thespeae refused to leave, not ordered to stay, not commanded, not shamed into it. They chose. These were not Spartans. They had not grown up in the Agoge. They had not been selected by Leonidas. They were soldiers from a smaller Greek city who looked at what was coming. Persians from the front, Immortals closing from behind. No escape, no reinforcement, no realistic chance of survival, and decided that standing here beside these men mattered more than living. 700 Thespians. History gave almost all the glory to the 300 Spartans. Films were made about the 300. Statues were built for the 300. The number 300 became one of the most famous numbers in the ancient world. But 700 men from Thespeae made the same choice that morning. They deserve to be remembered. Why did Leonidas stay? Historians have argued about this for centuries. Some believe he stayed purely to buy time, to ensure the retreating Greeks got far enough south that the Persian cavalry could not run them down before they reached safety. Others point to a prophecy delivered by the oracle at Delphi before the campaign began, that either Sparta would fall to the Persian advance or a Spartan king would die. Leonidas had read that prophecy. He had marched to Thermopylae, knowing what it likely meant for him personally. Whatever the reason, he stayed. And on the morning of the third day, he did something that surprised even the Persians watching from a distance. He advanced. Leonidas led his men out of the narrow pass and into the wider ground beyond it, not to find a better defensive position, not to attempt an escape. He moved forward because the pass no longer protected them, and because there was one final thing he could do: make the cost of this victory so catastrophic, so personally devastating for Xerxes that the Persian king would feel Thermopylae for the rest of his life. The Spartans and Thespians drove deep into the Persian formations, fighting to reach Xerxes himself. Spears breaking, swords drawn, shields used as battering rams when the blades were gone. Leonidas fell in the chaos of that final charge. The Spartans fought over his body, drove the Persians back 4 separate times to keep their king from Persian hands. Finally, surrounded completely, Persians pressing from every direction, the last of them gathered on a small hill. Xerxes ordered the archers forward. 10,000 bows raised toward that hill, and a warrior named Nekhus, who had been told before the battle that the Persian arrows were so numerous they would block out the sun, smiled at the man who delivered that news. "Good," he said quietly. "Then we will fight in the shade." The sky went dark, and the last of them fell. Xerxes had won the pass, but he did not feel like a winner. He had arrived at Thermopylae with the largest army ever assembled in human history. He had the Immortals. He had cavalry, archers, engineers, and supply lines that stretched back across 2 continents. He had every advantage that power and resources could provide. And a few hundred men had held him for 3 days. 3 days that would cost him everything. His first act after the battle revealed exactly how deeply Thermopylae had wounded him. He ordered Leonidas's body, found among the thousands of dead, had his head cut off, and placed on a stake for all of Greece to see. For a Persian king, this was almost without precedent. Persian rulers typically honored brave enemies in death. It was considered a mark of their own greatness to acknowledge the courage of those they had defeated. Xerxes knew this tradition. He had followed it before, but Leonidas had done something to him that went beyond military resistance. He had made Xerxes feel afraid, and Xerxes could not forgive that. The gesture achieved the opposite of what he intended. When the news of Thermopylae spread through Greece, not the fall of the pass, but the story of what happened there, the 3 days, the choice Leonidas made, the men who stayed beside him. It did not break Greek resistance. It ignited it. Every Greek city-state that was still free looked at what those men had done in that narrow pass and felt something shift inside them. The Persians were not gods. They were not unstoppable. They were men who had thrown everything they possessed at a handful of soldiers for 3 days, and had only won because of a traitor and a goat trail. That was not invincibility. That was a vulnerability. Weeks after Thermopylae, the Greek navy met the Persian fleet in the narrow straits near the island of Salamis. The Athenian commander, Themistocles, had studied what Leonidas had done at Thermopylae and applied the same principle to the sea. He drew the massive Persian fleet into a confined strait where their numerical advantage collapsed. Greek ships, faster, more maneuverable, crewed by men fighting for their homes, tore through the Persian formation with devastating efficiency. The Persian fleet was destroyed. Without his fleet, Xerxes had no reliable supply line across the Hellespont. His army, massive, hungry, stretched thin across foreign territory, began to weaken. He returned to Persia, leaving a force behind to finish the campaign. At the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, 1 year after Thermopylae, the Greek army met that remaining Persian force and crushed it completely. The invasion was over. Persia never seriously threatened Greece again. But here is the thing that must be said clearly. The thing that transforms Thermopylae from a military footnote into one of the most important moments in human history. Greece, in 480 BC, was not simply fighting for its own survival. It was, without knowing it, fighting for an idea. Athens, at that moment, was developing something the world had never seen before: democracy. The concept that ordinary people, not kings, not gods, not emperors, had the right to decide how they were governed. Alongside that, Greek philosophers were asking questions about the nature of reality, mathematics, science, and the human mind that would form the foundation of Western thought for the next 2,000 years. If Persia had rolled through Greece unchecked, if there had been no Thermopylae, no Salamis, no Plataea, that fragile, extraordinary experiment might have been extinguished before it could spread. There would have been no golden age of Athens, no Socrates, no Plato, no Aristotle. And without those foundations, no Roman Republic, no Renaissance, none of the democratic systems that govern most of the modern world today. The world you live in right now may have been saved by 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians standing in a 14-meter pass. The last stand of the 300 is not a story about war. It is a story about a choice. The choice every human being faces at some point in their life. when the odds are impossible, when walking away is reasonable, when everything logical says retreat. Leonidas looked at that choice and walked toward the enemy. History does not remember the men who calculated the odds and left. It remembers the men who stayed. Not because staying was smart, because it was right. That is what legend forged exists to find. The moments in history when ordinary men made extraordinary choices, and the world was never the same afterward. If this story made you feel something, subscribe. Because next, we go deeper. The warrior who brought the Roman Empire to its knees, defeated their greatest generals, humiliated their most powerful legions, and almost erased Rome from history entirely.